I never imagined that the walls closing in around me would be made of concrete and steel. For most of my life, the walls I lived within were softer. Kitchen walls stained with years of cooking, bedroom walls that heard my prayers at night, and living room walls that echoed with my children's laughter when they were young. I was a mother long before I was anything else, a grandmother before I ever became invisible. And yet here I was, sitting on a narrow metal bed inside a prison cell, wondering how loving too much had turned into my greatest crime. The first night in jail is something no one prepares you for, especially not when you are an old woman. The cold does not just touch your skin, it settles into your bones, the kind of cold that reminds you of your age with every breath. The mattress was thin, the blanket smelled of detergent and strangers, and the silence was louder than any noise I had known. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision I had made as a mother, asking myself where I had gone wrong. I raised my children the only way I knew how, with patience, sacrifice, and a love that never asked for anything in return. I skipped meals so they could eat more. I wore the same coat for years so they could have new ones. When they fell, I lifted them. When they failed, I protected them. And when they grew up, I believed they would remember all of it. That was my mistake. People think prison is the punishment, but for a mother like me, the real punishment started long before the bars closed behind me. It began with small things: missed phone calls, unanswered messages, holidays spent alone while my children were too busy. I told myself not to complain. Mothers are supposed to endure quietly. Grandmothers are supposed to smile and accept whatever scraps of attention are offered. The day everything fell apart did not begin with anger or shouting. It began like any other ordinary day. I remember standing in my small kitchen, hands trembling slightly as I poured tea into a chipped cup I had owned for decades. The house was quiet, too quiet. That silence had become familiar, but that morning it felt heavier, as if it knew something I didn't. When my daughter finally arrived, her face was tight, her words rushed. She spoke to me not like a mother, but like a problem that needed solving. I didn't understand at first. The accusations came wrapped in frustration, mixed with blame that didn't belong to me. Money, papers, responsibilities I had carried for years without complaint. Somehow, all of it had turned into evidence against me. I tried to explain. I always tried to explain. But mothers' explanations rarely matter once children decide they are tired of listening. By the time the police came, my legs could barely hold me. I remember clutching the edge of the table, my heart pounding not from fear of jail, but from disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not after everything I had given. The neighbors watched quietly as I was led away, their eyes filled with curiosity, not compassion. As the cell door closed that first night, one thought echoed louder than the metal clang. I did not rot in jail because I was cruel. I rotted here because I loved the wrong people too much. And that was only the beginning. The days inside the jail did not move forward the way days used to. Time didn't flow. It dragged itself, heavy and stubborn, like it didn't want to go anywhere. Morning and night felt the same, measured only by the sound of metal doors opening and closing, by footsteps echoing down the corridor, by the tray of food slid through the slot without a word or a glance. I tried to remind myself that this was temporary. I had survived worse, hadn't I? Poverty, loneliness, widowhood, years of carrying a family on my shoulders without ever asking for help. But prison was different. Prison didn't just lock your body. It stripped away your dignity piece by piece. The other women in my block were younger, louder, harder. They moved with a sharpness I no longer had. When they asked me why I was there, I could barely bring myself to answer. How do you explain that your own children turned your life into a courtroom? That the hands you once held while teaching them to walk were the same hands that signed papers against you? At night, when the noise finally faded, my mind became the loudest thing in the cell. I replayed memories like an old film, worn and scratched. I saw my children as toddlers clinging to my legs. I heard their voices calling me Mom, with a warmth that once filled the house. I remembered the nights I stayed awake when they were sick, the years I put my dreams away because theirs mattered more. And now here I was, An old woman counting cracks in a concrete wall. The shame was heavier than the bars. Not because I believed I deserved to be there, but because the world outside would never hear the full story. They would see an inmate number, not a grandmother. A charge, not a lifetime of sacrifice. I worried about what my grandchildren would be told. Would they believe I had done something terrible? Or would they simply forget me altogether? One afternoon, a guard called my name and told me I had a visitor. My heart jumped before I could stop it. For a brief, foolish moment, I believed one of my children had come to their senses. I imagined apologies, tears, maybe even regret. I smoothed my hair with trembling fingers, trying to look like myself again. But no one came. The chair across from me remained empty. The guard cleared her throat, annoyed, and motioned for me to return to my cell. That walk back felt longer than the first night I arrived. Every step was a reminder of how easily I had been erased. Later that evening, I sat on my bunk and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the quiet tears I had swallowed for days, but deep, aching sobs that shook my chest. I cried for the woman I used to be. I cried for the mother who believed love was always enough. And I cried for the painful truth settling into my heart. My children were not coming to save me. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity. I realized that the jail hadn't taken my freedom. My family had done that long before. The cell was only the final proof of a truth I had refused to see. I had spent my entire life protecting others, even when it cost me everything. And now, I was paying the price alone. As the lights dimmed that night, I whispered a promise to myself, barely audible in the dark. If I ever walk out of this place, I will no longer beg for love that was never meant to be returned. That promise would change everything. Days passed, then weeks. I stopped marking time by hope and started measuring it by survival. The routine became my armor. Wake up. Wash my face with cold water. Eat what I could. Keep my head down. Speak only when spoken to. In a place like this, invisibility was safer than kindness. Yet even in jail, life finds ways to test you. One morning, a new woman was brought into our block. She was crying uncontrollably, her hands shaking as if the world had ended. The guard shoved her toward an empty bunk and walked away like she was nothing more than extra weight. The other women ignored her. I didn't. I couldn't. Something in her sobs reminded me of myself. Years ago, when my husband died and the house suddenly felt too quiet. I offered her a piece of bread from my tray. She looked at me like she hadn't expected compassion to exist here. "Thank you," she whispered. That single word stayed with me all day. It reminded me that even locked away, I was still me. Still a mother. Still a woman who knew how to care. But kindness comes at a cost. Later that week, an argument broke out in the common area. Voices rose, tempers flared, and suddenly a guard was shouting orders. We were all pushed back into our cells. That night, my name was called again. This time, it wasn't for a visitor. I was taken to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. A woman sat across from me, my public defender. She looked tired, like someone who had stopped believing the system worked, but showed up anyway. She spread papers across the table and began talking about dates, statements, and evidence. That was when I heard it clearly for the first time. My children had testified against me. Not one. All of them. They had described me as difficult, controlling, unstable. They said I had threatened them, manipulated them, made their lives unbearable. I listened quietly as my defender spoke, but inside, something broke that could never be repaired. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that I had raised them alone, paid their school fees, cooked their meals, watched their children while they built their careers, that I had given everything without ever keeping score. But the room didn't care about my truth. It only cared about paperwork. When I returned to my cell, I didn't cry. Tears felt useless now. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm that comes after loss, when there's nothing left to protect. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment I had ignored the warning signs. The disrespect disguised as jokes. The impatience when I spoke. The way they only called when they needed something. I had told myself it was just stress. Just life. Just how children are. I was wrong. I realized something painful but freeing. Love without boundaries is an invitation to be used. The next day, I asked the guard for access to the library. She raised an eyebrow but handed me a slip. Books became my refuge. I read about women who had lost everything and rebuilt from ashes. I read about law, about rights, about silence as strength. Each page gave me something my family had taken, clarity. One afternoon, I received a letter. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My eldest daughter. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting remorse. There was none. She wrote about moving on. About how this situation was hard on everyone. About how the grandchildren were better off not being involved. At the end, she added a line that cut deeper than any insult. Please don't contact us again unless absolutely necessary. I folded the letter carefully and placed it under my mattress. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof. Proof that my silence going forward would not be weakness. It would be choice. That night, as lights went out, I made another promise to myself. Not whispered this time, but firm and unshakable. They taught me how to be alone. When I leave this place, they will learn what that truly means. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But for the first time since the cell door closed behind me, I knew one thing for certain. I was not finished. Something inside me shifted after that letter. It wasn't anger anymore, and it wasn't sadness either. It was clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after you've cried all the tears your body can make. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come and stopped imagining reunions that only existed in my memories. Jail had stripped everything away, my home, my reputation, my family, but in doing so it gave me something I had never truly owned before, myself. I began paying closer attention to the world around me, not with fear, but with awareness. I noticed how guards treated inmates differently based on who spoke confidently and who shrank into corners. I noticed which women were punished often and which ones were left alone. Power, I realized, didn't always come from force. Sometimes it came from calm, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. I started helping women fill out forms, writing letters for those who couldn't read well, explaining rules I had learned the hard way. Word spread quietly that the older lady knew things, that she listened, that she didn't judge. Respect came slowly, but it came. One evening, a guard stopped me after roll call and asked how I always managed to keep my cell in order, how I avoided trouble. I looked at her and said simply, I raised children for decades. This place doesn't scare me. She laughed, but there was something else in her eyes, acknowledgement. Around that time, my public defender returned with unexpected news. A procedural error had been found in my case. Small, technical, the kind of thing most people overlook. But it mattered. It meant my sentence could be reviewed. For the first time, the word appeal entered the conversation. I didn't celebrate. I had learned not to. Hope, when it comes too fast, can be cruel. Instead, I prepared myself. I gathered dates, memories, documents I could recall. I told my story calmly, without embellishment, without begging. I spoke like a woman who had nothing left to lose. And that made people listen. Nights were still hard. The silence was loud. And loneliness wrapped around me like a second blanket. I thought of my grandchildren often, wondered if they asked about me, if my name was ever spoken in their home. But I stopped imagining myself knocking on doors that had been closed deliberately. If freedom came, it would not be to return to the same role. The unpaid babysitter, the silent supporter, the woman who absorbed everyone's burdens. If freedom came, it would be on new terms. I was no longer the mother who waited. I was becoming the woman who decided. And as I lay on my narrow bed one night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I understood something that changed everything. Jail had not broken me. It had exposed the truth. And truth, once seen, can never be unseen. The day of the appeal hearing arrived without drama, no loud announcement, no sense of justice marching in to rescue me. It came quietly, like everything else in my life had. I wore the same plain uniform, my hair pulled back neatly, my hands steady even though my heart felt like it was beating somewhere outside my chest. Sitting in that cold room, facing people who would decide my fate, I didn't see enemies anymore. I saw strangers who didn't know me, who didn't know the years I had spent waking up early to make lunches, saving pennies, holding crying children through the night, forgiving things that should never have been forgiven. When they asked me questions, I answered slowly, clearly, without emotion clouding my words. I spoke about facts, about timelines, about inconsistencies, but behind every sentence was a lifetime of endurance. My public defender glanced at me more than once, surprised, I think, by how composed I was. This was not the broken old woman they expected. This was someone who had survived betrayal and learned to stand upright in its shadow. When the hearing ended, I was escorted back without explanation. Days passed. Then weeks. Silence returned, heavier than before. During that time, a letter arrived from my daughter. The first one. It was short, careful, filled with words that sounded rehearsed. She said she was sorry things turned out this way, and that she hoped I was managing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done, only distance wrapped in polite language. I folded the letter and placed it under my mattress, not as something precious, but as proof. Proof that even now, she was protecting herself, not me. Yet strangely, it didn't hurt the way it once would have. I had already grieved the mother-daughter relationship I thought we had. One evening, just as I was preparing myself for another sleepless night, a guard called my name. Her tone was different. Neutral but not unkind. She told me the appeal had been approved for review, and that there was a strong chance my sentence would be reduced significantly. Reduced. Not erased. Not apologized for. But changed. As I sat back down on my bunk, my legs trembling, I didn't cry. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the weight of that moment settle slowly. Freedom was no longer a fantasy, but it wasn't guaranteed either. And I realized something important then. Whether I walked out of those gates or not, I was no longer the woman who had been dragged in. Jail had tried to shrink me, but instead, it had sharpened me. I had learned how to exist without validation, how to survive without love, how to respect myself even when no one else did. If I left, I would leave changed. If I stayed, I would stay whole. And that knowledge, more than any ruling, gave me strength. The decision didn't come the way I imagined it would. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden rush of relief. It arrived folded inside an official envelope, handed to me by a guard who had already forgotten my name by the time she walked away. I sat on the edge of my bunk for a long time before opening it, my fingers resting on the paper, as if it might burn me. When I finally read the words, they felt unreal. Sentence reduced, eligibility for early release approved, time served acknowledged. I read it again and again, slowly, like a child learning to read for the first time, afraid that if I rushed, the meaning might disappear. My chest tightened, not with joy, but with something heavier. Freedom was suddenly close enough to touch, and with it came fear I hadn't expected. What waited for me outside? A daughter who had learned to live without me. A home that might no longer feel like mine. A world that had moved forward while I stood still. That night, the women around me congratulated me quietly, some with genuine smiles, others with eyes full of longing. I hugged the ones who had shared their stories with me in whispers after lights out. Women who had become my strange, temporary family. As I lay down, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed every choice I had made as a mother. Every moment I had ignored my own pain to protect my children. Every time I told myself that sacrifice was love. I wondered if I had taught them to value me, or if I had taught them that I was easy to discard. Days later, during my final processing, I received another letter from my daughter. This one was longer. She wrote about how hard everything had been for her, how much pressure she felt, how she never meant for things to go this far. Still no apology. Still no accountability. I realized then that some people don't say sorry because doing so would force them to face who they really are. I didn't write back. For the first time in my life, I chose silence not out of fear, but out of strength. When the gates finally opened for me, the air outside felt too wide, too loud. I stood there with my small bag of belongings, feeling older than my years but lighter in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't walking back into the same life I had left. I was walking into a new one, carrying the truth that jail hadn't broken me. Betrayal had tried, but failed. And as I took my first step forward, I promised myself something I should have promised decades ago. Never again would I set myself on fire just to keep someone else warm. Walking out of those gates didn't feel like a victory parade. There were no familiar faces waiting with open arms, no signs, no tears of joy. Just the quiet hum of the road beyond the fence, and a sky that looked too big for someone who had lived between concrete walls for so long. I stood there for a moment, breathing in air that didn't smell like disinfectant or despair, reminding myself that this was real. A volunteer from a local women's support group drove me to a small transitional apartment, a place with thin walls, second-hand furniture, and a bed that felt impossibly soft. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me sit up, my body still trained to respond to bells and footsteps. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the window, and for the first time in years, I made my own cup of tea. I held the warm mug in both hands and cried quietly. Not because I was sad, but because no one was watching me, judging me, or timing my movements. Days passed slowly. I learned the rhythm of the neighborhood, the names of the women at the center who helped me find clothes, a doctor, and counseling. They didn't look at me like a criminal. They looked at me like a woman who had survived something heavy. That alone felt like healing. Then came the message I knew would arrive eventually. My daughter called. Her name lit up my phone like a warning sign. My hands shook as I answered, but my voice stayed calm. She talked quickly, nervously, telling me she had heard I was out, that things had been misunderstood, that maybe we could talk, maybe I could come stay with her for a while until I got back on my feet. I listened without interrupting, something I had always done as her mother. When she finally paused, waiting for my familiar reassurance, I said something that surprised us both. I told her I was proud of myself. I told her I was safe. And I told her, gently but firmly, that I would not be coming to live with her. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. She accused me of being cold, of punishing her, of abandoning my role as a mother. I felt the old guilt rise in my chest, the reflex to apologize even when I had done nothing wrong. But this time I didn't give in. I told her that loving her didn't mean disappearing anymore. That motherhood didn't require martyrdom. That I deserved peace in my final years, not chaos disguised as family duty. She hung up on me. I sat there afterward, heart pounding, but also strangely steady. For the first time, I had chosen myself without hatred, without revenge, without cruelty. Just truth. Weeks later, I began volunteering at the same center that had helped me, listening to other older women who felt invisible, discarded, blamed. I saw myself in their eyes, the fear of being unwanted, the shame they carried that didn't belong to them. Slowly, my story became something I shared, not as a confession, but as a warning and a promise. You can survive betrayal. You can outgrow the roles that hurt you. One afternoon, while walking home, I passed a cafe window and caught my reflection. The woman looking back at me had lines on her face, gray in her hair, and a posture that spoke of endurance. She wasn't broken. She wasn't bitter. She was standing. And in that moment, I realized the greatest revenge was never jail, or silence, or distance. It was living a life where my worth was no longer up for debate. Time has a quiet way of putting everything in its proper place. Months passed, and the anger that once lived in my chest softened into something calmer, something wiser. I built a small life that belonged only to me. Morning walks where no one hurried me, evenings with books instead of accusations, and conversations that didn't require me to explain my worth. I learned that freedom isn't just walking out of a prison gate. It's the ability to say no without fear and yes without guilt. I stopped waiting for apologies that might never come. Forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't something I owed to others. It was a gift I gave myself so I could breathe without bitterness. My daughter called again, this time quieter, more unsure. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to talk. I listened, but I no longer folded myself to fit her comfort. We spoke like two adults, not a ruler and a servant, not a judge and the accused. I wished her well, and when the call ended, I didn't feel hollow. I felt complete. Some nights, memories still visit me, cold walls, harsh voices, the echo of a door closing behind me. But they no longer define me. They are chapters, not the whole book. I stand now as a woman who knows that respect is not something you earn by suffering, and love is not proven by endurance alone. If you are listening to my story and feel unseen, unheard, or used, know this. It is never too late to choose yourself. Age does not cancel dignity. Motherhood does not erase personhood. And silence is not strength if it costs you your soul. I was told to rot in jail, to fade quietly, to accept less because I was old. Instead, I learned how to stand taller in the years I have left. My life did not end behind bars. It began when I stopped begging for permission to live it.